For much of my life, I have not been a Christian. I was not brought up as a Christian. My father was Jewish by race, but he was an agnostic by religion. And my mother was an Anglican, but not a church-going Anglican. So I wasn't brought up as a Christian, and in fact, most of my sort of early experience of church was pretty negative, and I didn't really like church, and I didn't really like Christians. I was very suspicious of Christians. I'd met some. They seemed to me a little over-enthusiastic. I was deeply suspicious of their smiles, and I avoided them like the plague. And I was, in my first year at university, I was sharing rooms with a guy called Nicky Lee, who was then his girlfriend was Scylla, now his wife, and I kind of warned them about these Christians and said, whatever you do, don't go near them. But unbeknown to me, Nicky had met them and actually kept it secret from me because he knew that I was a bit suspicious of. One time, he and his then girlfriend, now wife Scylla, came back, and they told me that they had become Christians. And I was devastated. I mean, they were such lovely people. And I thought, how can I help them? They've obviously joined some cult, and I need to help them. But I didn't know how to help them because I didn't really know anything about faith or Christianity or anything. So I thought, I must do some research. I must read all around this subject. And it was about 11 o'clock at night when they told me, and it was too late to go out and buy anything. So I looked on my bookshelf, and I found I had this old Bible I'd had for RE lessons at school. And so that night, I started reading it. And I read all the way through Matthew's Gospel, all the way through Mark, all the way through Luke. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was about halfway through John's Gospel when I fell asleep. And the following morning, I carried on reading. I read all the next day, all the next day, all the next day. I was a student. I didn't have any work to do. And I completed the whole of the New Testament. And by the time I read it, I came to the conclusion, it's true. I didn't want to become a Christian. That was the last thing in the world. I thought if I became a Christian, life would be miserable from then onwards, like all the Christians that I'd seen, but with the smiles, but I didn't really think they were real. And so I didn't want to do it, but I thought it was true. And what I want to talk about this evening is why. Why, now 30-something years later, am I still convinced it's true? What is the evidence? I don't think you can prove Christianity there are different types of proof. You can't obviously prove it like mathematical proof, 2 + 2 = 4. It's just, these are symbols that we've invented. But I don't think you can prove it philosophically. You can't prove it scientifically. But those are not the only kind of proofs. If you think that there's historical proof, or my background is law, legal evidence. I practiced as a barrister. I did law for almost 10 years. And I come from a sort of family of barristers, really. My son is a barrister. My daughter's doing her bar exams at the moment. My sister is a barrister. My father was a barrister. My mother was a barrister. My grandfather on both sides were barristers. My uncle was a barrister. If we'd had a cat, it would have been a barrister. So I have this kind of legal, law is everywhere. And to me, evidence, maybe that's one of the reasons why evidence is so important to me. And I personally couldn't be a Christian if I didn't believe there was good evidence for faith. But it's not something that you can prove with like 100% certainty because it requires faith. And actually, there are a lot of things in life that require faith. Love requires faith. Love and faith are very closely connected, actually. But even a jury requires faith because the jury wasn't there when the events took place. They listen to the evidence and they take a step of faith. So, of course, there are differences, but I think it's akin to that. This is looking at historical facts, things that happened in history, and making a decision about it. It still takes a step of faith, But what I want to argue tonight is it's not irrational. You don't have to sort of cut your head off and throw it away in order to be a Christian. You can use your brain, you can think things through rationally, and you can still have faith that is rational. So you might say, well, why are you talking about Jesus? You might say your question is there a God? That was my question. I didn't believe there was a God. That's why I wasn't interested in Jesus. That seemed to be the next question. If you believe in God, well then, who is Jesus? But the first question is there a God? But what happened to me was it turned that upside down. Because I had an encounter with Jesus Christ that made me believe that Jesus actually had risen from the dead and that God was to be seen in terms of, through the lens of Jesus. So if you'll bear with me, let me just take you through the stages of the argument. Because the first question, I guess, that some people may be asking, well, did Jesus even exist? Is there any evidence that Jesus existed? And the answer is, yes, there is evidence that Jesus existed. There's evidence outside the New Testament. Suetonius talks about Jesus indirectly, Tacitus directly, and the Jewish historian, Josephus, talks about Jesus. This is what Josephus writes about Jesus. He says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a doer of wonderful works." And he goes on to talk about the crucifixion and the alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside. Whoops, what have I done? Oh dear, so sorry, made a mess. That was Josephus' fault. So there's evidence outside the New Testament, but there's also, and this is the most important source of evidence, there's evidence inside the New Testament, and that's the main source of evidence. So some people say, well, look, the New Testament that we have here, surely this has changed over the years. Over the hundreds of years, hasn't it? People put their own spin on it, if you like. And the answer is, we do know what the original writers wrote through a science called textual criticism. So the way this works is that obviously the original writers wrote in manuscript. They didn't have the printing press then. And those manuscripts were copied. And the way that it works is that the more copies that we have, and the closer they are to the original, the more certain we can be about what the original said. So if you compare, and you'll see in the manual, a comparison there with Herodotus and Thucydides, were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy is AD 900. There's a 1300-year gap, and we have 8 copies of each. Yet no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Take Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year gap, 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950-year gap, 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. Come to the New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD. The earliest copy, 130, full manuscripts at 350. Gap is much, much smaller. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, 9,300 others. It's unique amongst ancient prose writings. And no secular historian would disagree with that. So we do know from evidence outside and inside the New Testament that Jesus existed. And we do know that this pretty much is what the original writers wrote. So the question then is, okay, so who is Jesus? Who was Jesus? We know he was fully human. I don't think anybody disputes that now. He had a human body. He'd get tired. He ate. He slept. He had human experiences, love, friendship. He went through suffering. He went through torture. He went through death. But the question is, some people say, yes, okay, he was a human being. Maybe he was a great human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher. But no more than that. So Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code suggests that Jesus was not the Son of God, He was a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man of staggering influence. In other words, a great religious teacher. On the other hand, Bono said this: I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I do believe that, odd as it sounds. So who's right, Brown or Bono? What is the evidence to suggest that Jesus was more than a great religious teacher? So Matthew, page 993, Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's possible to be with someone for quite a long time and not realize who they are. I love to play squash. I'm a pretty regular squash player. I play most days. But the place where I play squash is also a gym. And if there's no one to play squash with, I go into the gym. And one time, this was quite a long time ago, I went into the gym and there was a big guy in there. His name was Paul Ackford. He was an England rugby international at the time. He's now a rugby correspondent. But I didn't realize that. And I was doing weights with him. He was lifting these massive weights. Even then, I was lifting puny little weights. But afterwards, we were chatting in the showers, and I was trying to make polite conversation. So I said to him, "Do you do any other sport?" Meaning apart from weightlifting. I think he assumed that I must know he played rugby. So he said, "Yeah, I play a bit of squash." So I said, "Is squash your main sport?" He said, "No, rugby's my main sport." So I said, "Oh, really? Do you play for a club?" So he said, "Yeah." He said, "I play for a club." So I said, "Which club do you play for?" He said, "Harlequins." So I said, "Oh, Harlequins, yeah, they're pretty good, aren't they?" I said, "They've got some England players playing for them, haven't they?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "How many England players have they got playing?" He said, 5. I said, "Have you ever played for England?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "When did you last play for England?" He said, 2 weeks ago in the World Cup. And I looked at him and I said, "You're Paul Ackford." I'd been with him all that time. I hadn't realized who he was. And the disciples look at Jesus and they go, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, the question is, were they right? What is the evidence? And the argument's really got 2 parts. First part of the argument is, who did Jesus think he was? Because it seems to me if Jesus didn't think he was the Son of God, if Jesus didn't think he was a man whose identity was God, then that's the end of it. Because if he didn't think that, that's it. So the first part of the argument is, who did Jesus think he was? But even if Jesus did think he was a man whose identity was God, it doesn't prove that he was. And we then have to ask, what is the evidence to support that? So the first part of the argument is, what did Jesus think about himself? And there are really 3 pieces of evidence here. The first piece of evidence is Jesus' teaching was centered around himself. And you have to understand, I'm sure you realize this, religious teachers are meant to be humble people. They're meant to point away from themselves. They're meant to say, "No, don't look at me, look at God." Jesus, in pointing people to God, pointed to himself. So, take, for example, something that is very true, I think, of all human beings. There is a kind of spiritual hunger. I think every human being knows it's just not enough to get up, go to work, go home, watch TV, or go to bed, get up, go to work, do whatever, go out and party at the weekend. There's something more. We know that there's a hunger in the human heart. 3 leading psychologists in the 20th century of all this, Freud said people are hungry for love. Jung, people are hungry for security. Adler, people are hungry for significance. Jesus said, if you want that hunger satisfied, come to me. I'm the bread of life. People, it's a symptom of our society, isn't it? Increasingly is this whole area of addiction. Many people are struggling with addictions of one kind or another. And those are kind of obvious addictions. But actually, in some ways, all of us, according to Jesus, all of us, in a sense, are addicts. Because if we do something that is wrong, it becomes very addictive. But Jesus says, if the Son sets you free, he says, I'm the one who can set you free from those addictions. Many people are kind of in a kind of dark place, I think. They're depressed, they're disillusioned, they feel that, like almost that they're, in darkness. And Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. That there's an interesting attitude to death in our society, because in the Victorian world, people talked a lot about death, but never talked about sex. Now people talk a lot about sex, but they never talk about death. It's become a sort of taboo subject almost, and people find ways of avoiding the word death. Even in hospitals now, they try to avoid mentioning the word death. I heard of one hospital, they have a politically correct way of referring to it as negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, people die. And Mother Teresa was asked, are you afraid of dying? She said, no, not at all. I'm really looking forward to it. Because Jesus said, I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will not die. They'll have eternal life. People are looking for a kind of way to lead their lives. And Jesus said, I'm the way. People are looking for values. Jesus said, I'm the truth. People are looking for meaning, purpose. He said, I'm the life. Others said, this is the way, this is the truth, this is the life. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It was all centered on himself. He said, anybody who welcomed him, welcomed God. Anyone who received him, received God. He said, anyone who's seen me has seen God. I heard of a 6-year-old child who was drawing a picture in school, and the teacher said, what are you drawing? And the child said, I'm drawing a picture of God. The teacher said, well, you can't do that because no one knows what God looks like. And the girl said, well, they will do in a minute. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. That's the first piece of evidence, his teaching centered on himself. The second piece is kind of indirect. He said things which, they weren't direct claims to be God, but he put himself in a position of things that only God can do. Just let me give you one example. He went up to people he'd never met before and said, your sins are forgiven. If someone offends you or if someone offends me, I can forgive them, you can forgive them. But if we've never met someone, we can't go up to them and say, your sins are forgiven. Only God can do that. And when Jesus started to say that, the people of the day, the lawyers, said, that's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And then there's his direct claims. Here we see an example in this passage of Jesus' direct claim to be the Son of God. But he goes even further than that. If you'd like to turn to John chapter 20, verse 26, page 1100. This, page 1100, John 20, verse 26 to 29. This is after the resurrection. Jesus had appeared to the 11 remaining disciples, and, 10 of them he'd appeared to, but Thomas hadn't been there. Thomas is a bit like, I guess lawyers are a bit cynical, and Charlie told you last week he's a bit of a cynic. I'm definitely on the cynical side. And I think my reaction might have been a bit like Thomas, because his 10 friends, his 10 best friends came back and said, look, we've seen Jesus. And Thomas said, no way, he's dead. I'm not going to believe that Jesus is risen unless I actually see those hands and put my fingers in the nail marks and put my hand in the side that was pierced. I'm not going to believe unless I see that. And they're in the room, and Jesus appears. And Jesus says to Thomas, look, put here on my hand, put your fingers in them. Put your finger in my side. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, this is verse 28, my Lord and my God. Thomas calls him God. What is Jesus' reaction? Jesus says, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who've not seen and yet have believed. He doesn't say, oh, no, hang on, Thomas. Don't call me God. That's going too far. He says, you're a bit slow to get the point. If you'd like to turn back a few pages. If you only had to John 10, page 1087. If you only had time to show somebody one verse. If somebody says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only have time to show them one passage, I wouldn't suggest you do it on one passage, because it's an argument really based on the whole of the Bible. But if you did have time to show them one passage, you might like to show them this, because John 10, verse 30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. So that's the argument, if you like, the first half of the argument, that Jesus really did make those claims. That was, he claimed to be a man whose identity is God. Now, that's only the first part of the argument, as I say, because that doesn't mean he was, because you can be deluded, you can be making all sorts of claims because you're an imposter, but you have to decide. What Jesus didn't leave open is the possibility that he's just a great religious teacher. Because making those claims, they're either true or they're not true. Christopher Hitchens, brilliant mind, and of course an atheist, but he very much saw this point. He said this, if Jesus wasn't the Son of God, he was a hideous, wicked imposter whose words were vain and empty and intended to deceive. In other words, he says, you've got to decide. He hasn't left open the possibility that he was just a great religious teacher. So what evidence is there to support his claims? Well, let me suggest, if someone made a claim like that, to have the identity of God, you would look pretty carefully at a number of things about them. And I would suggest the first thing that you might look at is well, what other things do they say? What are they teaching? Jesus' teaching is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that has ever fallen from anyone's lips. If you think of the things that Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Do good to those who hate you. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And he's the first person to say this, love your enemy. And Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. We've advanced. Isn't it amazing how fast we advance in science and technology? Every year there's a new version of the iPhone coming out. Always improved, always better than the one before. But nobody's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words that you'd expect God to speak. And then there's the stuff that Jesus did. You look at, well, okay, I'm interested in what you say, but I'm always interested in how you act. Jesus must have been the most amazing person to be around. I was so wrong. I thought Christianity was boring. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is nothing boring about Jesus. Jesus was this amazing guy. Jesus goes to a party. The wine runs out. he says, okay, fill up some jars with bathwater and start pouring it out for the guests, and let's see what happens. So they fill up, okay. So they fill up these things with bathwater and they start pouring it out, and out comes Chateau Lafite 45, BC, that is. Amazing. I mean, imagine going hospital visiting with Jesus. He gets to the hospital, this guy's been there 38 years. He says, just pick up your bed and walk out. The guy walks out. Imagine going on a picnic with Jesus. No need to bring any food. Imagine going to a funeral with Jesus. Jesus went to a funeral one time. The guy had been dead for 4 days. He says, Lazarus, come out. The guy walks out. Give him something to eat. Not just his miracles, but his love for the people who society rejected. This has been a feature of the church ever since. Care for the hungry, the homeless, the people who are marginalized in society. It's amazing love. And supremely, it's shown in the fact, Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, than they lay down their life for their friends. And supremely, you see his action in laying down his life for his friends. Then there's his character. People who wouldn't call themselves Christians have recognized this. Time magazine described Jesus as the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of humanity. The people who knew him well said, this guy's, if you hang around with someone for 3 years, if you share a flat with someone for 3 years, you know that person, you know their good things, but you also know probably not everybody's perfect. There'll probably be some weakness. But the people who knew him really well said, Jesus, there's no sin in him. People said, he does everything beautifully. Then there's another piece of evidence, which is, again, this is unique about Jesus, because a lot of people have lots of books written about them after they've lived. But Jesus uniquely had a whole series of books written about him before he lived. So the Old Testament contains over 300 prophecies about Jesus. 29 of them he fulfilled in a single day. Some people said, well, okay, maybe Jesus knew the Old Testament, he went through it, he realized the kind of things he had to do, and then he set out to do them, so it looked as if he was fulfilling the prophecies. The problem about that is that they are so detailed, and a lot of the things are things he had no control over. The exact manner of his death was prophesied. His resurrection was prophesied. Even the place of his birth was prophesied. No good, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. Fifth piece of evidence is this is the real key, his conquest of death. And this is the linchpin, if you like, of the whole thing. And it's the crucial thing, because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that's it. It really is. I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't believe Jesus rose physically from the dead. And this is not purely academic. I mean, a lot of this talk, you might think, it's a bit kind of, we're looking at manuscripts and just Cephas. It's all a bit kind of, but this is very practical, really. Because the fact is, everybody here is going to die. I don't want to disillusion you or be depressing about it, but it is statistically the case that 1 in 1 die. So unless you're going to break that statistic, you are going to die. You and I are all going to die. Now, that's very depressing, isn't it? But there is a question, what happens then? I suspect everybody here has been to a funeral. You go to a funeral, the body is buried. It goes down into the ground, and that looks like the end. And it is the end. Unless Jesus was buried and then raised to life. If he was, as this book claims, then it also says that's the first fruits. That what happened to Jesus is what is going to happen to us. So it matters whether Jesus was raised or not. And what is the evidence? Well, here's the first piece of evidence. Jesus' body was absent from the tomb. Everyone knew where that tomb was. And when they got to the tomb, his body was not there. So what is the explanation for that? People have said, well, okay, maybe he recovered and got out. But you don't recover from crucifixion. I don't know if any of you have seen the film The Passion, but if you see there what crucifixion meant. And people don't recover from crucifixion. There's a 1.5-ton stone put across to guard it. But more than that, there's a very interesting piece of evidence. If you're still in John 10, if you move on to John 19, verse 33 and 34. This to me is a fascinating little piece of evidence. This is when Jesus was being crucified. Page 1098. When they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they didn't break his legs. Breaking the legs was a way of speeding up. It was a sort of merciful act to speed up crucifixion, so they died from asphyxiation. But when they came to Jesus and found he was already dead, they didn't break the legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Well, that suggests the separation of clot and serum, which we now know is good medical evidence that he was dead. They didn't know that at the time. They just wrote it because that's what happened. So that explanation that Jesus hadn't really died doesn't work. Another explanation is, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. They were very upset about what happened to Jesus, so they stole the body and started a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. That really doesn't work. Again, leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, it is psychologically improbable because they were depressed, disillusioned, and suddenly they were changed. And more than that, most of them, probably all of them suffered hugely for what they believed. Most of them died horrible deaths by crucifixion or other horrible means. And when they were being tortured, if they had stolen the body, all they had to say was, no. We don't really believe that. But none of them did. They knew they had seen the risen Jesus. I have a friend who was a scientist at Cambridge, a guy called Ian Walker. And he became a Christian. He said he could not believe that all those disciples would have died for something that they would have known was not true if they'd taken the body. Other people said the authorities stolen the body. But if the authorities stole the body, why didn't they produce it when people were saying Jesus is risen? They couldn't. They hadn't got it. Others have said robbers stole the body. But again, there's a fascinating, in John chapter 20, there's a fascinating account where Peter and John hear that Jesus is risen. They're told. Because Jesus' first appearance was to a woman. And this woman, Mary, tells them, I've seen Jesus. And Peter and John run to the tomb. And when they get to the tomb, they look in, and they find, this is why I haven't used this expression, the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body had gone, but the grave clothes, the only valuable thing in the tomb, was still there. It collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerged. And the piece that had been over Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And it says, when they saw that, they believed. So that's the first piece of evidence, is his absence from the tomb. Secondly, his appearance to the disciples. Jesus was seen on a number of different occasions, 11 different occasions. On one occasion, by a group of 500 people, over 500 people. It's probably about the number of people that are downstairs here. People say, it's hallucination. Really? Hallucination? Everybody having the same hallucination? And look at the people involved who saw Jesus. The hallucination occur with highly strung, highly imaginative, and very nervous people, or people who are sick or who are on drugs. These were tough fishermen, tax collectors. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. And then there's the nature of the appearances. This is the last passage we'll look at, just a few pages back. Luke chapter 24, page 1072. Page 1072, verse 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he'd said this, he showed them his hands and feet, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. I have a friend called James Odgers who became a Christian because of that verse. He said he could not believe that a ghost would eat broiled fish. That's the nature of the appearances. Then, so his absence from the tomb, his appearances to the disciples, and then thirdly, the immediate impact. The world changed at that moment. There was this peaceful revolution that spread, starting with this group of uneducated fishermen and tax gatherers that totally transformed the whole known world. And then there's Christian experience down the ages. There are now 2,000 million people in the world who profess an encounter with Jesus Christ. And they're people of all backgrounds. We've had the privilege, because Alpha's now running in 169 countries. We haven't been to all those countries, but we've been to many, many countries. And it's an amazing thing to go to all these different countries and cultures and see that people have this same faith, this same experience of an encounter with Jesus Christ. So when I kind of looked at all this evidence, when I think about those things, given that Jesus made these claims, which I believe he did, is he really a sort of evil megalomaniac who was either totally deceived or kind of made it up? Or then it's the only real alternative. Is he the person he claimed to be? And when I looked at it, I came to the conclusion there really is enough evidence to take a step of faith. And very reluctantly, at that moment, because as I said to you, I thought life was going to be miserable from then onwards, I said, first of all, I'll delay it to my deathbed. Then at least I can enjoy my life. And just before I die, I'll put my faith in Jesus. And I thought, I can't do that. There's no integrity about that. So I said, okay, life will be miserable from now on. Okay, and basically all I said was, yes, okay. And at that moment, it dropped from here to here. And I actually experienced, like those 2,300 million others around the world, an encounter with the risen Jesus Christ. I didn't see him physically, but I experienced a relationship, which I have now experienced for the last nearly 38 years. And I have mess up, I have my ups and downs. This doesn't mean that you live a perfect life. Certainly in my case, very, very far from perfect. But I have experienced this amazing relationship over those years with Jesus Christ that has had a transforming effect on my own life, on our marriage, our family, on our friendships, on everything that we do. And that's why, for all the reasons that I've given, that I've come to the conclusion that I really do believe it's true.